The C-47 shook hard in the prop wash of the plane ahead of it. Inside, 82 men sat in 2 rows, their faces grease-blackened, their equipment strapped and restrapped until nothing rattled. They had been sitting like this for hours. Some slept, some stared at the aluminum skin of the fuselage. A few prayed quietly, lips barely moving. The jump master stood near the door, one hand gripping the overhead cable, watching the red light above the door the way a man watches a pot he needs to boil. Below them, the English Channel disappeared and the coast of Normandy filled the darkness with muzzle flashes. It was just after midnight on June 6, 1944. The German High Command had spent much of the previous 2 years constructing an argument that American soldiers were fundamentally unsuitable for elite warfare. The assessment wasn't entirely without basis. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Green American infantry had broken under coordinated German armor and artillery, retreating in disorder and leaving behind several thousand prisoners. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had driven into that gap and nearly unraveled an entire American corps. German officers noted it clinically. Americans were brave enough individually. The consensus went, but they lacked the depth of training, the tactical instinct, and the institutional hardness that the Wehrmacht had spent a decade developing. They would fight, but they would not hold. The airborne specifically drew additional skepticism. The concept itself, dropping lightly armed infantry behind enemy lines without armor support, without continuous supply, without a defensive perimeter, struck many German planners as operationally reckless. You were taking your most aggressive soldiers, stripping them of everything heavy, and depositing them precisely where they were most vulnerable. The German military had conducted its own airborne operations in Crete in 1941 and paid catastrophically for them. Over 4,000 paratroopers killed or wounded in 10 days. Hitler had reportedly told Kurt Student, the father of German airborne doctrine, that the day of the paratrooper was finished. It was a weapon that revealed itself on first use and could not survive a prepared defense. So the thinking went. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had never dropped in combat at night, at scale, under fire, into terrain their navigators couldn't reliably identify. That was the reality of a Normandy mission. The plan called for tight formations of C-47s to hit specific drop zones inland from Utah and Omaha beaches, putting infantry on the ground in organized serials that could rally quickly and move to objectives. Roads, causeways, bridges. The terrain features that would determine whether the beach landings could get off the sand or die on it. What happened instead was a masterclass in controlled catastrophe. Anti-aircraft fire over the coast broke the transport formations apart. Pilots who had trained for tight element flying suddenly found themselves alone in the dark, taking flak, trying to maintain altitude and airspeed while their passengers were being thrown around the inside of the plane. Many pilots accelerated, some dove. The drop altitudes varied wildly. Men exited at 300 feet in some cases, barely enough for a canopy to open, and at over 2,000 feet in others, which meant long exposure in the air over positions that were already shooting at them. The drop zones were supposed to be marked by Pathfinder teams inserted 30 minutes earlier. Many of those teams had missed their own zones. The result was that roughly 13,000 American paratroopers were scattered across an area of several hundred square miles in the dark. Private First Class David Webster of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, hit the ground alone. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know where anyone in his stick was. He had his rifle, his ammunition, and a cricket, a small metal clicker used for identification challenges. 2 clicks meant American. 1 click meant respond or die. He crouched in a hedgerow and listened. The bocage of Normandy was a landscape built for ambush. Dense earthen walls topped with vegetation, narrow lanes between fields, almost no sight lines beyond 20 meters. It was the worst possible terrain for an infantry force that had just been scattered across it in the dark. This was a situation German planners had not fully modeled. They had assessed the airborne as a tactical concept. What they had underestimated was the doctrine and the psychology that had been built into the men executing it. American airborne training had been deliberately constructed around the assumption of isolation. Every soldier was trained to look at his immediate situation, identify what needed to be done, and begin doing it regardless of whether anyone was giving him orders. The assumption baked into every rehearsal was that you would land wrong, find yourself disoriented, and encounter the enemy before you found your own unit. The training answer was always the same: complete the mission with what you have. This was not the German model. The Wehrmacht's tactical excellence depended heavily on unit integrity, on NCOs who knew their squads, on company commanders who could see their platoons, on communications that allowed rapid concentration. A German unit that was scattered and disorganized became significantly less effective. The training did not build for radical decentralization in the same way. In Normandy, that difference became a force multiplier that no German order of battle could account for. In the hours after midnight, small groups of American paratroopers, sometimes a single squad, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, began appearing at road junctions, at the edges of villages and farmyards, at the approaches to the causeways that crossed the flooded lowlands behind Utah Beach. They came from different regiments, different companies, different states. Some had no idea which unit the men next to them belonged to. It didn't matter. They were all going the same direction. They had all been told what mattered. At La Fere Bridge, a mixed group of 82nd Airborne Paratroopers from multiple units found themselves holding a narrow causeway crossing against German armor with nothing heavier than a bazooka. The fighting there lasted for 3 days. They held it at Sainte-Mère-Église. The 82nd secured the first French town liberated on D-Day with a collection of men who had landed across a radius of several miles and coalesced around a common objective. The German garrison in the town was overwhelmed not by a coordinated assault, but by the relentless pressure of men arriving from multiple directions with no apparent command structure and no apparent intention of stopping. At the causeways behind Utah Beach, the critical terrain that would determine whether the seaborne landing could move inland or be bottled on the beach, small teams of 101st Airborne soldiers seized and held crossing points against defenders who outnumbered them and had prepared positions. The beach landing came ashore. The causeways were open. What the German defenders encountered in those early hours was not what their planning had anticipated. They had expected the disorder of scattered drop to produce paralysis. Some of it did. Units that landed in the flooded field south of Sainte-Mère-Église took catastrophic casualties, men drowning in 4 feet of water under the weight of their equipment, unable to get upright before they sank. The airborne paid a severe price for the navigational failures of the drop. But the men who got down on dry ground did not behave like a disorganized force. They behaved like individuals who had each been given the same problem and the same answer. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Folly, commanding the 91st Infantry Division, one of the German units specifically repositioned to the Cotentin Peninsula in May 1944 to counter an airborne landing, was killed on a road near his headquarters in the early hours of June 6. He had left his command post to investigate the reports of paratroopers. He drove into an ambush set by a group of American soldiers who had landed miles from their drop zone and were moving toward whatever objective they could find. The soldiers didn't know who he was. They shot him because he was in a German staff car on a road in Normandy at 2 a.m. Folly became the first German general officer killed on D-Day. He was dead before the beach landings began. The assessment that American paratroopers were a manageable threat had been, at its root, an assessment built on a reasonable reading of institutional data. Kasserine was real. The operational risk of airborne warfare was real. The Crete disaster was recent and well documented. None of that analysis was fabricated. What it missed was what happens when you take men who have spent 18 months training for exactly the scenario, scattered, isolated, behind enemy lines, without support, and drop them into it. The chaos that was supposed to be paralyzing was familiar. It was the environment they had rehearsed. The disorganization that should have degraded their effectiveness had been anticipated and trained against until the individual soldiers' default response was not to freeze, but to move. By the time the sun came up on June 6, more than 13,000 American paratroopers were behind the German coastal defenses. Many were miles from where they were supposed to be. Most were with men they barely knew. Almost none of them stopped moving. The generals who had dismissed them were now being asked to explain why their rear areas were no longer secure.